The thunder cracked like a whip across the darkening Montana sky as Vaughn Ryder squinted up at the growing hole in his cabin roof, knowing full well that another storm season was about to make his neglect all the more apparent. It was 1878, and like most things in his life since the war, the roof had fallen into a state of disrepair that matched his spirit, broken, weathered, and barely holding together. Rain began to pelt down as Vaughn retreated inside his humble cabin nestled in the foothills of the Bitterroot Mountains. The place wasn't much, but it was a small parcel of land with decent grazing for his modest herd of cattle, far enough from town that folks didn't bother him with their questions about his past, or the scar that ran from his left temple to his jaw. He positioned a collection of buckets and pots beneath the worst leaks, a routine he'd perfected over the past 3 seasons. The water drummed against the metal, creating a chaotic symphony that somehow soothed him. Vaughn had long ago decided that fixing the roof wasn't worth the effort. Who was there to impress out here? The coyotes? His horse? Another fine evening at Ryder Ranch, he muttered to himself as he stoked the fire in his small stone hearth. The flames cast dancing shadows across the sparse furnishings, a wooden table with 2 chairs, though he only ever needed one, a bed with a patchwork quilt his mother had made before she passed, and shelves lined with books, his one indulgence. The next morning dawned bright and clear, the storm having blown itself out overnight. Vaughn saddled his horse, a sturdy buckskin gelding named Chief, and rode out to check on his cattle. The spring grass was coming in nicely, promising a good season ahead. As he crested a hill overlooking his property, he spotted something unusual near the creek that cut through the eastern edge of his land. It was a wagon, its canvas cover torn and flapping in the breeze. Curious and cautious, Vaughn approached slowly, his hand resting on the revolver at his hip. As he drew closer, he could see that one of the wheels had broken, leaving the wagon tilted awkwardly toward the creek bank. "Hello," he called out, stopping Chief a safe distance away. "Anyone there?" A figure emerged from behind the wagon, and Vaughn's breath caught in his throat. A woman stood before him, her dark hair pulled back in a loose braid, her dress mudded at the hem. She regarded him with wary green eyes, a small shotgun held cautiously at her side. "This is private property," Vaughn said, his voice rougher than he intended. The woman straightened her spine. "I'm aware. My wheel broke last night during the storm. I was trying to make it to Helena." Vaughn noticed then the bruise blossoming on her cheekbone, the careful way she held herself as if nursing an injury. "You're alone?" he asked, scanning the area for signs of others. "Yes," she answered simply, offering no further explanation. Something about her proud stance despite her obvious distress stirred something in Vaughn that he thought had died years ago. "Name's Vaughn Ryder. This is my land." "Violet Lawson," she replied, lowering the shotgun slightly. "I'll be on my way as soon as I can fix my wagon." Vaughn glanced at the broken wheel, noting the splintered spokes and cracked hub. "That's not a quick fix, Miss Lawson, not without proper tools and a new wheel." A flash of something desperation perhaps crossed her face before she controlled it. "I have money. I can pay for repairs." Vaughn shifted in his saddle. The smart thing would be to point her toward town and be done with it. He'd worked hard to maintain his solitude, to keep the world and its complications at bay. But the darkening clouds on the horizon promised another storm, and the thought of leaving this woman to face it alone didn't sit right. "Another storm's coming," he said, nodding toward the sky. "You can stay at my cabin until it passes, then I'll help you get that wheel fixed." Surprise registered on her face. "That's very kind, but it's not kindness," Vaughn interrupted. "Just being practical. Can't have you freezing to death on my property. Bad for business." A small smile tugged at her lips. "What business would that be, Mr. Ryder?" "Cattle," he replied, not returning the smile. "Come on, gather what you need. We can come back for the rest later." Violet hesitated only briefly before nodding. She disappeared into the wagon and emerged with a small carpet bag. Vaughn dismounted and helped her up onto Chief, trying to ignore the scent of lavender that clung to her despite her travel-worn appearance. The ride back to his cabin was silent, Vaughn leading the horse while Violet sat stiffly in the saddle. As they approached his home, he became acutely aware of its shortcomings: the weathered exterior, the sagging porch, and most notably, the gaping hole in the roof. "It's not much," he said gruffly as he helped her down. Violet looked up at the cabin, her expression unreadable. "It has walls and she paused, noticing the damaged roof. "Well, mostly a roof." Vaughn felt an unfamiliar heat creep up his neck. "Been meaning to fix that." "I see," she replied, and Vaughn could have sworn he saw the ghost of a smile cross her face again. Inside, the evidence of the previous night's rain was still visible. Buckets and pots dotted the floor, some still holding water. Vaughn quickly emptied them, acutely embarrassed by the state of his home in a way he hadn't been in years. "You can take the bed," he said, gesturing toward the corner where his narrow cot stood. "I'll sleep by the fire." "I couldn't possibly." "You can and you will," Vaughn insisted. "You're injured." Violet's hand went to her cheek. "You noticed." "Hard not to," Vaughn replied, busying himself with building up the fire. "Want to talk about it?" "No," she said firmly. Vaughn nodded, respecting her privacy. "There's a creek out back if you want to wash up. I'll rustle up some dinner." While Violet was gone, Vaughn found himself straightening up the cabin, something he hadn't bothered with in longer than he could remember. He put a pot of beans on the fire and sliced some venison he'd smoked the week before. It wasn't fancy, but it was filling. When Violet returned, her face and hands clean, her hair neatly rebraided, she looked younger, vulnerable in a way that made Vaughn's chest tighten. They ate in relative silence, the occasional question about passing the salt or comment about the weather breaking the quiet. As darkness fell and the promised storm arrived, rain began to plink into the buckets once more. Violet watched the water drip through the ceiling with undisguised curiosity. "How long has your roof been like this?" she asked. Vaughn shrugged. "Couple of years, maybe 3. "And you never thought to fix it?" "What for? It's just me." Violet considered this, her green eyes thoughtful. "Don't you get tired of positioning buckets every time it rains?" "You get used to it," Vaughn replied, though her question made him realize how ridiculous his arrangement was. He'd simply stopped seeing the inconvenience, much like he'd stopped seeing the possibilities in his own life. That night, as Vaughn lay on a bedroll near the fire, he listened to the sound of Violet's even breathing from across the room, mingled with the rhythmic dripping into the buckets. For the first time in years, his cabin felt too small and too large all at once. Too small with another person sharing his space, too large with all the emptiness he'd allowed to fill his life. The next morning, Vaughn woke to the smell of coffee. He opened his eyes to find Violet standing at his small stove, stirring something in a pan. She'd found his meager supplies and appeared to be making breakfast. "Hope you don't mind," she said without turning around. "Seemed the least I could do for your hospitality." Vaughn sat up, running a hand through his hair. "No, I don't mind." They ate the simple breakfast of cornmeal mush sweetened with the last of his molasses, and Vaughn found himself studying Violet when she wasn't looking. In the morning light, the bruise on her cheek looked worse, purple and swollen against her pale skin. Her hands, though delicate, showed signs of hard work, the nails short and clean, the fingers nimble as she held her coffee cup. "We should check on your wagon today," Vaughn said as they finished eating. "See what can be salvaged." Violet nodded. "Thank you. I don't want to impose any longer than necessary." Something in her tone made Vaughn pause. "You in some kind of trouble, Miss Lawson?" She met his eyes steadily. "Aren't we all in some way or another, Mr. Ryder?" The response surprised a short laugh out of him. "Fair enough." They rode out to the creek together, the morning sun drying the damp earth from the previous night's storm. Vaughn examined the broken wagon wheel more thoroughly in the daylight, confirming his initial assessment. "This needs a wheelwright," he said, running his hands along the splintered wood. "I could try to patch it, but it wouldn't hold for long, especially not on these mountain roads." Violet sighed, looking at the wagon that contained everything she owned in the world. "How far is town from here?" "About 15 miles to Clearwater," Vaughn replied. "I could ride in tomorrow, see about getting a new wheel." "I have money," Violet repeated, reaching for her bag. Vaughn shook his head. "We'll settle up later. Let's get what you need from the wagon for now. Looks like the canvas took a beating in the storm." They spent the next hour salvaging Violet's belongings from the wagon. Vaughn was struck by how few personal items she had: some clothes, a few books, a small box of jewelry, and a worn photograph of an older couple he assumed were her parents. Everything spoke of a hasty departure. As they were finishing, Vaughn noticed a man's jacket among her things. Without thinking, he asked, "Your husband's?" Violet stiffened. "No." The tone of her voice told Vaughn not to press further. They loaded her belongings onto Chief and began the trek back to his cabin. Halfway there, dark clouds rolled in again and a light rain began to fall. "Montana weather," Vaughn commented. "Never can trust it." By the time they reached the cabin, the rain had become a downpour. They rushed inside, somewhat damp but not soaked through. Vaughn immediately began positioning his collection of buckets and pots under the leaks. Violet watched him for a moment before asking, "Do you have any tools and lumber?" Vaughn looked up at her, puzzled. "Some. In the lean-to out back." "Why?" "I was thinking," she said, her voice careful, "that perhaps we could fix your roof while I'm here, as payment for your help." Vaughn straightened, a bucket in hand. "You know how to fix a roof?" A small smile played at her lips. "My father was a carpenter. I helped him often enough to know the basics." Something about her offer touched Vaughn deeply. No one had offered to help him with anything in years, largely because he never allowed it. His self-imposed isolation had become so complete that the simple gesture of assistance felt foreign. "The rain's likely to continue for a few days," he said, looking up at the ceiling. "Not much we can do until it clears." "Then we'll plan," Violet replied. "And when the sun comes out, we'll get to work." Over the next 2 days, as rain continued to fall intermittently, Vaughn and Violet fell into an unexpected routine. They shared meals, with Violet proving to be a far better cook than Vaughn with the same limited ingredients. They talked, cautiously at first, then with growing ease, though both carefully avoided certain topics. Vaughn didn't ask about her bruises or why she was traveling alone. Violet didn't inquire about the scar on his face or why he lived in such isolation. Instead, they discussed books. Violet had a passion for poetry that surprised Vaughn and exchanged stories about places they'd seen. Vaughn found himself telling her about his cattle, the challenges and rewards of ranch life, and his plans to expand his herd come fall. Violet shared memories of growing up in Ohio, her father's woodworking shop, and her dream to someday own a small piece of land where she could plant a garden full of flowers. On the third morning, Vaughn awoke to sunlight streaming through his window. The storm had finally passed. He found Violet already awake, standing on his porch, surveying the property with appreciative eyes. "It's beautiful here," she said as he joined her. "Peaceful." Vaughn nodded, seeing his land through her eyes: the rolling hills dotted with pine trees, the creek cutting a silver path through the valley, the distant mountains rising majestically against the clear blue sky. "It is. Shall we look at that roof today?" Violet asked, turning to him with a determined expression. Vaughn hesitated. Part of him wanted to refuse, to maintain the boundaries he'd so carefully constructed. But another part, a part that was growing stronger in Violet's presence, wanted to see what it would be like to work alongside her, to create something better than what he had allowed himself to accept. "I suppose we could," he finally agreed. They spent the morning assessing the damage and taking inventory of the materials in Vaughn's lean-to. He had enough lumber for the basic repairs left over from when he'd built the cabin and the necessary tools. By midday, they had a plan. "I'll need to go up there," Vaughn said, looking at the roof. "We both will," Violet corrected. "I'll hand you the materials and help secure the boards." Vaughn raised an eyebrow. "It's not proper work for a lady." Violet laughed, a sound that Vaughn realized he'd been unconsciously trying to elicit for days. "Mr. Ryder, I believe we're well past concerns of propriety, unless you have a spare lady's maid hidden away somewhere." Vaughn found himself smiling in response, the expression feeling rusty on his face. "Point taken, Miss Lawson." They worked through the afternoon, Vaughn tearing away the rotted portions of the roof while Violet handed up new planks and nails. Despite her earlier claims, she did more than just assist. She demonstrated a real knowledge of construction, suggesting better ways to lay the boards and insisting on properly sealing the joints to prevent future leaks. As the sun began to set, they had completed almost half the repairs. Vaughn's muscles ached in a satisfying way, the kind of tiredness that comes from meaningful work. They sat on the porch, drinking coffee and admiring their progress. "Thank you," Vaughn said quietly, "for pushing me to do this." Violet looked at him, her expression soft in the fading light. "Sometimes we all need a little push." The next day, they rode into Clearwater together. Vaughn needed more nails to complete the roof repairs, and they still needed to arrange for a new wheel for Violet's wagon. The small town consisted of one main street with the essential businesses: a general store, a saloon, a blacksmith, and a small hotel. As they tied their horses outside the general store, Vaughn noticed Violet scanning the street nervously. "Something wrong?" he asked. She shook her head quickly. "No, it's just been a while since I've been around so many people." Vaughn understood that feeling all too well. They entered the store, and he nodded at the proprietor, George Miller, a man Vaughn knew only through their infrequent business transactions. "Ryder," Miller greeted him, then his eyes widened slightly at the sight of Violet. "And who might this be, Miss Lawson?" Vaughn replied curtly, uncomfortable with the man's obvious interest. "We need nails and some other supplies." While Vaughn gathered what they needed for the roof, Violet examined the store's limited selection of fabrics and household goods. Miller hovered near her, his curiosity evident. "You staying out at Ryder's place?" he asked, his tone suggesting the impropriety of such an arrangement. Before Violet could answer, Vaughn intervened. "Miss Lawson's wagon broke down on my property. I'm helping her get it repaired. Speaking of which," Violet added smoothly, "is there a wheelwright in town?" Miller seemed disappointed by the mundane explanation but directed them to the blacksmith, who also handled wagon repairs. After purchasing their supplies, they headed there next. The blacksmith, a burly man named Amos Tucker, examined the dimensions Vaughn had written down. "Can have a new wheel for you in about a week," he said. "Got a few jobs ahead of yours." Violet's face fell slightly. "A week? That's the best I can do," Tucker replied with a shrug. "Unless you want to try over in Helena, but that's a good 2 days' ride from here." As they left the blacksmith shop, Vaughn noticed Violet's pensive expression. "A week's not so bad," he offered, though he was surprised to find himself in no hurry for her to leave. "No, it's fine," she said, but her eyes continued to scan the street anxiously. Their errands complete, they stopped at the small cafe for a hot meal before heading back to the ranch. As they ate, Vaughn became aware of the glances and whispers directed their way. He rarely came to town and never with company, especially not female company. Their presence was causing quite a stir. "Ignore them," he said quietly when he noticed Violet's discomfort. "Small town, not much happens here." She gave him a grateful smile. "I'm used to it. People always want to know your business." As they were finishing their meal, the cafe door opened and a well-dressed man entered. Vaughn wouldn't have paid him any mind except that Violet went rigid beside him, her face draining of color. "What is it?" Vaughn asked, instantly alert. "Nothing," she whispered, lowering her gaze to her plate. "We should go." Vaughn studied the stranger tall, with an expensive suit and a gold watch chain visible across his vest. He had the look of money and the arrogance that often accompanied it. The man's eyes swept the cafe, passing over Vaughn and Violet without recognition. They paid for their meal and left quickly, Violet keeping her head down until they were safely on the street. "Want to tell me what that was about?" Vaughn asked as they untied their horses. It wasn't him, Violet said, relief evident in her voice. For a moment I thought, but no, just someone who resembled someone I once knew. Vaughn didn't believe her for a second, but he respected her privacy. Whatever or whoever she was running from, she clearly wasn't ready to share that burden. The ride back to the ranch was quiet, each lost in their own thoughts. As the cabin came into view, Violet broke the silence. It looks different already. Vaughn followed her gaze to the partially repaired roof. She was right, even half finished. The improvement was striking. It does. Over the next few days, they fell into a rhythm, working on the roof during the days and talking by the fire in the evenings. Vaughn found himself sharing more than he had with anyone in years stories about his time in the war, the injury that had left him scarred, his decision to seek solitude in the Montana wilderness after his parents died. In turn, Violet gradually revealed pieces of herself: her love of music, her skill with plants, her dream of someday teaching children. But she remained guarded about her recent past, deflecting questions about where she had been before her wagon broke down on his land. By the 5th day, the roof was complete. They stood back to admire their work, a sense of accomplishment warming Vaughn's chest. "No more buckets," Violet said with a smile. "Almost seems too quiet without them," Vaughn replied, returning her smile with ease now. It was remarkable how quickly her presence had become natural to him, how the cabin felt more like a home with her in it. That evening, as they sat by the fire, Vaughn found himself watching Violet as she read one of his books, her face soft in the firelight. The bruise on her cheek had faded to a yellowish shadow, and without its stark reminder, she looked younger, more carefree. Something tightened in his chest, a feeling he'd thought himself incapable of after so many years of numbness. "Violet," he said quietly, breaking the comfortable silence. "I need to ask you something." She looked up, her green eyes meeting his. "Yes, who are you running from?" The directness of the question seemed to startle her. She closed the book, her fingers tracing the cover as she considered her response. Finally, she sighed. "My stepbrother." Vaughn waited, giving her space to continue. "After my father died, my mother remarried," she explained, her voice steady though her hands trembled slightly. "Her new husband seemed kind at first, but after she passed away last winter, he changed, or perhaps he just stopped pretending." She paused, swallowing hard. "His son Victor became insistent that I should marry him. When I refused, he became violent." Vaughn's hands clenched into fists. "The bruise," she nodded. "I took what I could and left in the night. I've been traveling for almost a month, taking odd jobs along the way. I was heading to Helena, where I have a distant cousin." "And you think he's following you?" "I don't know," she admitted. "But the man in the cafe, for a moment I thought it was him. I can't be sure." Vaughn considered this information. The wheel will be ready in 2 days, but he hesitated, unsure if he should voice the thought that had been growing in his mind. "But what?" Violet prompted. "You could stay," he said, the words coming out in a rush. "Here if you wanted to." Surprise flickered across her face, followed by something softer, more vulnerable. "Why would you offer that?" Vaughn stood, moving to the window to gather his thoughts. Outside, the Montana night spread vast and star-filled. "Because in the week you've been here, this place has felt more like a home than it has in years. Because you saw a broken roof and didn't just accept it as it was. Because," he turned to face her, "because I'd like to see what happens next." Violet stood as well, her book forgotten on the chair. "Vaughn, I barely know you." "I know," he acknowledged, "and I barely know you, but I'd like to change that." She took a step toward him, her expression thoughtful. "What exactly are you proposing?" "Stay," he said simply. "Not forever if you don't want to. But long enough to see if there's something here worth exploring." He gestured between them. "I haven't felt this way in a long time, Violet, like maybe the future holds more than just getting through each day." Violet's eyes shimmered in the firelight. "I'm afraid," she admitted. "Not of you, but of hoping again, of believing that I could have something good." Vaughn understood that fear all too well. He'd lived with it for years, letting it wall him off from possibilities. But something had shifted when Violet entered his life, challenging him to see beyond his self-imposed limitations. "I'm afraid too," he confessed, "but I think maybe that's how you know it matters." Violet closed the distance between them, reaching up to touch his scarred cheek with gentle fingers. "You fixed your roof." "We fixed it," he corrected. "And it turns out a dry cabin is a nicer place to be." Her smile was radiant. "I've heard that a home is even better when shared with someone you care about." Vaughn's heart beat faster as he covered her hand with his own. "I'd like to test that theory." The next morning dawned clear and bright, full of possibility. Vaughn woke to find Violet already outside, standing at the edge of his property, looking out over the valley. He joined her, savoring the simple pleasure of her presence beside him. "I have an idea," he said as they watched the sun continue its ascent. "Let's ride to the north pasture." "There's something I want to show you." Curious, Violet agreed, and they saddled up after breakfast. The ride took them through pine forests and across meadows bursting with wildflowers. Vaughn found himself pointing out landmarks and sharing stories about his land that he'd never told anyone, experiencing the beauty of his home anew through her appreciative eyes. When they reached the overlook, Violet gasped. Below them stretched a perfect valley, sheltered by gentle hills and bisected by a clear stream. The morning sun bathed it in golden light, making the wildflowers seem to glow from within. "It's beautiful," she breathed. "I've been thinking of building here," Vaughn said, suddenly nervous. "A proper house with more than one room, a garden." He glanced at her. "Room for flowers." Violet's eyes widened as she understood the implication. "Vaughn, I know it's fast," he said quickly. "I'm not asking for promises, just possibilities. The wheel will be ready tomorrow. You could continue to Helena, see your cousin, but know that if you wanted to come back, there would be a place for you here." Tears glistened in her eyes. "How can you be so sure? You barely know me," Vaughn smiled, feeling freer than he had in years. "I know enough. I know that you're brave and resourceful. I know that you see potential where others see only brokenness. I know that when you smile, the world feels right in a way it hasn't for a very long time." Violet's laugh was watery with emotion. "And I know that you're kind despite your gruffness. That you're honorable and strong but gentle too. That you've been alone too long, just as I have. So what do you say, Violet Lawson? Would you consider giving Montana a chance, giving us a chance?" She looked out over the valley again, then back to him, her decision clear in her eyes before she spoke. "I think I'd like that very much, Vaughn Ryder." The next day, they rode into town together to collect the new wagon wheel. As the blacksmith loaded it onto their wagon, Violet wrote a letter to her cousin in Helena, explaining her change of plans. She didn't mention her stepbrother or his son. Instead, she focused on the future she hoped to build in this wild, beautiful corner of Montana. As they prepared to leave town, a commotion near the saloon caught their attention. A well-dressed man was asking questions of the locals, showing them a photograph. Even from a distance, Vaughn could tell it was the same man from the cafe days earlier, and the tension in Violet's posture confirmed his suspicion. "Victor," she whispered, her face pale. Vaughn made a quick decision. "Get in the wagon, now." She obeyed without question, and Vaughn took the reins, guiding the horses away from the main street onto a side road that would take them out of town by a less visible route. They rode in tense silence until the town was well behind them, then Vaughn slowed the horses to a more sustainable pace. "He's looking for me," Violet said, her voice small. "He won't find you," Vaughn assured her. "Not if you don't want to be found." She looked at him, fear and hope warring in her expression. "What if he doesn't give up?" Vaughn reached over to take her hand. "Then we face him together. This is your home now, Violet, if you want it to be, and I protect what's mine." The fierce protectiveness in his voice seemed to steady her. "Our home," she corrected gently. The word sent a surge of emotion through Vaughn's chest. "Our home," he agreed. In the weeks that followed, they fell into a new rhythm. They salvaged what they could from Violet's wagon and sold the rest in Clearwater. With the proceeds, they purchased lumber and supplies for the new house. Vaughn hired 2 men from town to help with the building, and by midsummer, the framework was taking shape on the northern pasture. They didn't rush their relationship, though they both felt the pull of something deep and genuine growing between them. Violet slept in the cabin's single bed, while Vaughn continued to make his bed by the fire. They worked side by side during the days, Vaughn with his cattle and the construction, Violet establishing a vegetable garden behind the cabin and helping wherever she was needed. In the evenings, they talked for hours, filling in the gaps in their knowledge of each other, sharing hopes and fears, discovering the countless ways they fit together like pieces of a puzzle neither had realized was incomplete. There was no further sign of Victor, though Vaughn remained vigilant. Violet gradually relaxed, her smiles coming more freely, her laughter a common sound around the ranch. She befriended the wives of nearby homesteaders, trading garden vegetables for fresh eggs and milk, weaving herself into the fabric of the community in a way Vaughn had never managed or wanted to, until now. By the time autumn painted the hills in gold and crimson, the new house was nearly complete. It wasn't large by some standards, 4 rooms downstairs and 2 above, but to Vaughn, who had lived for years in his 1-room cabin, it felt like a mansion. More importantly, it felt like a home, with Violet's touches everywhere: curtains she'd sewn for the windows, a quilt she'd begun for their bed, wildflowers she'd pressed and framed for the walls. Their bed. The thought still made Vaughn's heart race. They hadn't spoken explicitly of marriage, but it hung in the air between them, an unspoken promise waiting for the right moment. That moment came on a crisp October evening. They stood on the porch of the new house, watching the sunset paint the sky in spectacular shades of orange and pink. Vaughn had spent the afternoon installing the last of the windows, and now the house was completely weathertight, no buckets needed. "Do you remember that first day?" Vaughn asked, his arm around Violet's waist. "When you suggested we fix the cabin roof?" She smiled up at him. "You looked at me like I'd suggested we fly to the moon." "I couldn't understand why anyone would bother," he admitted. "I'd gotten so used to the leaks, to the buckets, to making do with what was broken." "And now," she prompted. Vaughn turned to face her fully, taking both her hands in his. "Now I can't imagine going back to that, just like I can't imagine going back to a life without you in it." Violet's eyes softened. "Vaughn." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small wooden box. Inside lay a simple gold band set with a small emerald. "I rode to Helena last week," he explained. "I wanted something that matched your eyes." Tears spilled onto Violet's cheeks as she looked from the ring to his face. "It's beautiful." "Violet Lawson," Vaughn said, his voice steady despite the thundering of his heart. "I never fixed my roof until I wanted a woman to stay dry. I never built a proper house until I wanted to share it with you. I never thought about the future until you showed me how much it could hold." He took a deep breath. "Will you marry me?" Her answer was in her eyes, in the way she reached for him, in the tears that spoke of joy rather than sorrow. "Yes," she whispered against his lips. "Yes." They were married 2 weeks later in the new house, with the local preacher officiating and their small circle of neighbors in attendance. As Vaughn slipped the ring onto Violet's finger, he marveled at how completely his life had transformed in the space of a few months. That night, as they lay together in their new bed in their new home, Vaughn held Violet close and made her a promise. "No more leaky roofs," he whispered. "No more making do with what's broken. From now on, we build something better together." Violet's answering kiss held all the promise of the future stretching out before them, a future neither had dared to imagine before that fateful stormy night when a broken wagon wheel and a leaky roof brought them together. 5 years later, Vaughn stood on the porch of their home, watching as Violet chased their 3-year-old son through the garden that now bloomed with vegetables and flowers in equal measure. Their daughter, just a year old, dozed in his arms, her small head nestled against his chest. The ranch had prospered under their joint care. The cattle herd had doubled and they'd added sheep and chickens. The original cabin still stood, now used as a storehouse for tools and supplies. Everything about the place spoke of care and attention, of a life being built with purpose rather than merely endured. As the Montana sunset painted the sky in familiar splendor, Vaughn thought about the man he had been isolated, resigned to his loneliness, unwilling to fix even a simple roof. That man would never have believed the fullness that awaited him, the joy that could be found in sharing his life, his land, his heart. Violet looked up, catching his eye across the yard. Her smile, still as radiant as the day they met, warmed him from the inside out. She said something to their son, then made her way to the porch, her steps light despite the new life growing once again within her. "What are you thinking about so seriously?" she asked, reaching up to smooth the furrow between his brows. Vaughn leaned down to kiss her gently. "Just that I'm the luckiest man in Montana. Because you have a dry roof over your head," she teased. "Because I have you under it with me," he replied, his voice rough with emotion. "Because you taught me that some things are worth fixing, worth building, worth protecting." Violet's eyes shimmered with unshed tears as she stood on tiptoe to kiss him again. "I love you, Vaughn Ryder." "And I love you, Violet Ryder," he answered, his heart full beyond measure. "More than I ever thought possible." As their son ran up to join them on the porch, clamoring for his father's attention, Vaughn silently thanked whatever twist of fate had brought a storm, a broken wagon, and a determined woman into his life, the woman who had shown him that a cowboy who never fixed his roof could become a man who built a home.